Welcome back. This afternoon, we are pleased to have a panel discussion entitled Mvskoke Allotments in the Oil Capital of the World, Reflections of Tulsa's First Landowners, with participants from the Lucinda Hickory Research Institute and Philbrook Museum of Art. The Lucinda Hickory Research Institute is a nonprofit organization founded to understand what happened to the allotted lands that were dispersed to Mvskoke Indians during the allotment era and to share the personal stories of allottees and their descendants. Representing the Lucinda Hickory Research Institute are Tatiana Duncan, founder and executive director of the Institute; Russell Cobb, professor of Latin American Studies and Creative Writing at the University of Alberta and Lucinda Hickory Research Institute vice chair; Danalisa Jones, Lucinda Hickory Research Institute secretary and treasurer, and an MD, PhD candidate at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Representing Philbrook Museum of Art are Kaylin Bernosky, Mellon Curatorial Fellow for Native Art, and Susan Green, the Marcia Manhart Endowed Associate Curator for Contemporary Art and Design.
The format of our presentation today will be a roundtable discussion with Russell Cobb and Tatiana Duncan representing the Lucinda Hickory.
We can't hear you. Closer to your mouth.
Is this better? I'm hearing mixed things. Oh, thank you. Is this better? Okay. So the format of our presentation will be a roundtable discussion with Russell Cobb and Tatiana Duncan representing Lucinda Hickory Research Institute and Susan Green representing the Philbrook Museum. Also present with us today in the audience are Marcella Giles, a member of the board of directors for Lucinda Hickory Research Institute, and Christina Burke, the curator of the Native American art at Philbrook Museum.
So we're gonna go ahead and get started. Can you all hear me okay? And I also want to say thank you all so much for being here for this conversation. It means a lot to us, and we can't wait to talk to you afterwards about everything as well. So we're gonna go ahead and start with the conversation. And the first question is, what is the story you're telling? And I think that maybe Russell can start this one off. Right? Oh, Tanya, sorry.
We got two.
We'll get there.
So the story we're telling, we're the voice of our Mvskoke people, our Mvskoke ancestors that were dispossessed of their allotted lands. They're just personal stories that we're trying to collect to kind of just, for somebody who grew up with the narrative that our land was stolen, we always wondered, what does that even mean? So, in short, am I saying how LHR got started? Okay, let me just tell you how LHR got started. That might help. So let me start by saying Estongo. Estongo. Tatiana Duncan Joho Jifkados, Nogoshlagi Dawaz, Eldawe Kwesadi Dawaz. My name is Tatiana Duncan, my clan is Bear, and my tribal town is Kwesardi. My tribal town is my history. I have not been connected to that, but that is what my grandmother was. I am a Mvskoke Cherokee native. I'm the founder of the Lucinda Hickory Research Institute. We were founded in January of 2020, although I believe it's been a work in progress my whole life. Two ancestors that I speak about in my presentation are my Aunt Sally and my Uncle Sam. I speak about my grandmother also, but I never met her because she passed of cancer in 1951. My Uncle Sam, I met him only one time, and I was in awe of his presence. And I could never figure out why, except that perhaps it was because I was meant to one day tell his story. My Aunt Sally, we lived close to her, and I was from the era of children are to be seen and not heard. So when I was around her, we sat down and we were quiet. But I always remember observing and studying that beautiful native elder. And today I think she had all the answers to the questions that I have, but they didn't speak about these things. So now let's move forward to 1991. That's when the World Wide Web was introduced to the public. I remember being at work. I was in the Navy, so I'll give you the G-rated version of what they were saying. They said that you could type anything into your computer and it will give you the answer. And we're all like little kids, anything? So later that evening, I was home, my husband was out to sea, I put the kids to bed, and I thought, anything. And the first thought was my grandmother. I entered in her maiden name. Well, first of all, I thought, there's no way that I'm going to enter in my American Indian grandmother who was born in the early 1900s, and this thing is going to know. But when I did enter her name, Lucinda Hickory, it populated one result. And that was, if you followed us, you heard this last year. That was a court statement that read, "My name is Lucinda Hickory. I am a sister of Sally and Sammy Hickory. We are the heirs of Jenny Hickory, deceased. We are the miners whose lands are attempting to be sold by the guardian at the time. Sally and I are attending the convent school at Purcell, Oklahoma. Sammy is staying with Mrs. Sally Morrison near Broken Arrow. I am 15 years of age. I have been attending I've been attending school at Purcell for the last 4 years. Sally, Sammy, and I inherited this land from my mother, Jenny Hickory. I would like to hold the land. I don't want the land sold. I am the oldest one of the miners who owns this land. I talked with my mother in regard to this land before she died." It was like the ghost of my grandmother had just shown up. We had never heard that before. The emotions of turmoil ran through my mind and my body as I pondered what I had just read. What happened to the land? What transpired between my grandmother making this statement and to us having nothing left in Tulsa, Oklahoma? And we probably had somewhere like 1,120 acres of land. And then when that narrative, actually at that time, I didn't even know that's how much land that we had. But now let's fast forward to the age of instant information, where you can just about Google a college education. But I wasn't doing it that day. I was scrolling through Facebook, and I found an article about my ancestor, Tugabachi, who is the original allottee of Gathering Place, written by Dr. Russell Cobb. And it was on a Facebook page, a private Facebook page of a Seminole Creek citizen. So I utilized my Facebook etiquette, and I said, I would like to share this because I'm a descendant of Tugabachi. With that, it attracted the attention of who is the co-founder of the Lucinda Hickory Research Institute, J.D. Colbert. That's how J.D. and I met. J.D. began emailing me all the information he had on this history, along with another person, Gina Covington, who dedicated a lot of time with this. I had many questions. I then proceeded to do my own research. I used Ancestry.com, newspapers.com, the Oklahoma Historical Society, and let me tell you, their Dawes roll numbers, searching tool is my favorite. And the collection of Indian pioneer papers are fabulous to read. I also used the Gateway of Oklahoma History. I thought that was incredible. I was up all night long, many, many, many nights. I was building up quite a file. The research that they had provided, along with my own research, caught me off guard on how much it affected me. To be very honest, sometimes I cried. I couldn't sleep at night. And I had a discussion with JD over the phone because he was in Oklahoma, I wasn't here yet. And I told him how much it vexed me. And he suggested that I maybe make it the rest of my life's work to tell these stories and to start a nonprofit. And I thought, a nonprofit? Well, I know nothing about that. He's like, it's easy. A lot of my friends have done it. So I sat down with my husband and I discussed with him. I said, Chris, I have to get back home. I have work to do. It took about a year, and we left his home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and came here to my home in Oklahoma at the end of 2019. From the end of January 2020, the beginning of February 2020, I qualified my nonprofit with the state and the federal government. In March 2020, we went into the worldwide quarantine. So this has been a painstaking journey for sure, more downs than ups, but we are still new. The Lucinda Hickory Research Institute is a platform for our Mvskoke voice to tell our Native story from our Native American perspective. And I would like to take a moment to thank Philbrook, Susan, Christina, Kaylin for going above and beyond beyond the regular land recognition, so that we can meet our Mvskoke ancestor, Lena Jefferson, and her family for the first time. Allottees. And so in honor of our ancestors who were under attack for their land, language, and heritage, we continue the journey.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tatiana. So I'm Susan. I'm one of the curators at Philbrook. And it is my honor to share this stage with Tatiana, Deanna, Lisa, and Russell, and Kaylin. And also here at the Oklahoma Historical Society, and I want to thank the Oklahoma Historical Society for sharing this space for this conversation. We are in the beginnings of our research, because our research, this history is thousands of years, and this is just maybe the first 10 years of our history that we've been doing this research. So it needs to go much further. So a little bit about our, and do you mind if I have the printer? Oh, yeah. And just as a mention, so Philbrook, so here we have Philbrook behind me. Philbrook sits on ancestral land of the Caddo, the Osage, Quapaw, and Wichita multiple tribes. And then, of course, that land, the Mvskoke then came to the land, were forcibly removed, and we want to honor our ancestors. And one of the things that we dealt with here or not here at Philbrook, but in Tulsa at Philbrook, is thinking about our history. And when we think about our history, or our visitors might think about our history beyond just the museum and the gardens, they might think about this family. Wade and Genevieve Phillips with their children, Helen, Jane, and Elliot. So this is typically what's thought of. And if you think about the founder of Philbrook, most people think of Wade Phillips, not even Genevieve. Genevieve often is sort of an afterthought. So what is the full history of Philbrook? Let alone the dozens of people who lived on the Philbrook property, including, this is Perry Brower, who lived with his wife, Pearl, and their family, and were part of the caretakers of Philbrook. So there's a bigger story than just the 4 Phillips family members. But I really wanted to know what truly was the beginning of the land with Mvskoke allotment. And we have, this is one of our archival maps. So this is the land that most people think of. This is the 1926 plotting of the property, but what was before that? And I want our public, Philbrook wants our visitors to know not just the Phillips family, but also this family. And isn't this an absolutely amazing, joyous photograph? This is Barbara Linthicum Smith, her mother, Ravella, her grandmother, Lena Davis Jefferson, and her great-grandmother, Nancy Perryman Jefferson. And Barbara is in the audience here today, Barbara and her daughter, Julie. And I would love to recognize them. Can we get one? So this photograph was taken in 1952, and the ages span from about 20 to about 93 or so. These are 4 strong, amazing women, and women that aren't a part of the Philbrook record, but should be. So Lena Jefferson, the allottee, is actually not in the photograph. There's 2 Lenas, so that can get confusing, but Lena Harjo Jefferson was our original allottee. She passed away in 1907, so she's not part of this photograph, but to have these amazing, joyous faces looking upon us, I think it's a blessing, and it's something that I want us to further and to recognize and to acknowledge. So we wanted to know what was our history. So we dug into our record. We had always known that Lena Jefferson was our allottee, but we didn't know more about them. Who are they? What's the family? This is the 1900 census when we were still Indian Territory, and you can see I've pulled those out. So we have Lena Jefferson, her son Moses, her son Thomas, and her son Walter, the 3 living sons, her 3 living children. She was a widow at this time. Around this time is the allotment process. So 1899 and 1900, she signs allotment papers, land that was probably chosen for her. On the right are the allotments for Moses and Thomas, 2 of her sons, and the same day she signs, note is signed for her, showing that she has not yet made a selection. The next day, they are interviewed. This was a standard process. During the allotment process, the allottee was interviewed. And it's in these sort of archival documents that you can find glimmers of the actual Native voices. One of the barriers for research is that these documents are created by the government, by the colonialist powers, by people that are telling a very specific story. And the Native voices are often suppressed. But here we have Lena saying, so the question is, why don't you make a selection for yourself? So this is the interview about her son's allotments. Why don't you make a selection for yourself? I have a home where I'm living and I have not applied for it because I thought my living there would hold it. I thought my living there would hold that land. You had better make a selection so as to keep out of trouble. The neighbors there live in the same quarter. 2 of them, there are people already there who have that allotment. You better settle the matter up and make your selection so that implication of a threat is there. Then it takes a couple of months and she's finally allotted a piece of land. And so was this land that she wanted? Was this where she wanted to be? And one of our resources, of course, are the Hastain maps. And so just to kind of give you all a context, if you're familiar with Tulsa, you can see the Arkansas River. You can see the box where Lena Jefferson was allotted land. It's just south of Helen Woodward's allotment, which is where Woodward Park is, 21st and Peoria. And then for context also, the red blocks are Jefferson family members. So Lena Davis Jefferson was in the photograph, as was Nancy Perryman Jefferson. So 2 of those blocks are their allotments. And then purple, Lucinda Hickory with LHRI is named after, and then Dukabaji, who is, again, Tatiana's ancestor, are in purple. So you can see how these allotments are all connected. Also, as a note to think about as you're driving through Tulsa, 21st, 31st, 41st, 51st, Peoria, Harvard, Yale, if I get them right, Sheridan, those are all section lines, but as we drive through Tulsa, we're driving through the allotment system. We're driving through the borders of people's allotments, this kind of, this residue isn't the right word, this sort of detritus of the colonialist power breaking up families, breaking up this communal living system, and determining where people would live. Also, sort of to give you a greater sense of where this family was, and then how the allotment then dispersed them or tried to disperse them. So Lena Jefferson, from the census records and governmental records, we know that she and her family, her 3 sons, were living around Weir, Oklahoma, which is south of Broken Arrow. So somewhere in there, that was their post office box, but they lived somewhere in the country. Then in 1899, 1900, they were allotted lands, and notice how disparate how much the spread is. And thinking about traveling in this part of the state when the roads aren't there. It's not automobiles, it's carriages or horses or walking. And so they are literally allotted land miles apart. And is the mother going to leave her sons when they live together to live in her allotment? And then in 1900 in the census, she lives somewhere in this section. And you can see that Walter, the oldest son, actually was allotted land somewhere in this section, but we don't know if that's actually where they were living. And then Lena Jefferson dies in 1907, and in 1910 the census shows them living somewhere near Coweta. So again, in that same area. But in 13 and in 1920, the records show that Thomas and Moses, and Walter has passed away, Thomas and Moses are probably now actually living on their allotment. And this group of names, you can see that they're still living all together. So Moses and his wife, Nancy Perryman, their children, Nora Davis and Buena Vista, Thomas and his wife, Lena Davis Jefferson, who was actually a daughter of Nancy Perryman, Ravella and Willis and Sonora, who's Walter's daughter. So they're all living together communally. And then in 1930s, when the family kind of splits up, Thomas lives with his second wife, still on his allotment, and the rest of the family moves to Nancy Perriman Jefferson's allotment, which is where Barbara has shared that's where she grew up. So Barbara was raised by Nancy Perriman Jefferson. But again, all of the family is still living together. So we don't think that the Jefferson family ever lived on the property where Philbrook was built. In 1907, and just again, this is sort of all of those allotments together, and thinking about these communal family groups being forced to spread apart, or to choose, or to decide to sell their land, or for the land to be taken from them. So again, the stories that we're telling, in 1907, Lena Jefferson passes away. Her middle son, Moses, is appointed sort of executor of the estate. He's already, as part of the prejudicial, racist process of guardianship, his mother can't be guardian of her own children. So the youngest son, Thomas, is underage. And we don't exactly know maybe where Moses was. Moses was appointed guardian of his brother, even though his mother was still living. And Moses is essentially executor of the state. And we have documents, again, as you're going through these records, kind of pulling out the native voices, pulling out the actual stories that aren't told by the government. So something like, as we're trying to explore and find out more about Lena Harjo Jefferson, things like from this document, which is Sonora's newborn enrollment, the granddaughter's newborn enrollment, that Lena Harjo Jefferson served as midwife. So thinking about the grandmother serving as midwife for her grandchild. These moments and finding these threads. And then also going through our abstract, which is typical, you would have kind of the plat of land, and then this transcription of different records, including then the sales. And so for Philbrook, Lena Jefferson dies in 1907. Her sons then sell the property. Moses is the sort of the executor, and they start selling the property. This is where my next step is in research, is researching the people that purchased those lands, and whether it was under duress, whether it was equitably given monetarily, if they got a fair price, essentially. But then the family, again, stayed on Thomas's allotment or Nancy Perriman's allotment. And so just kind of digging in and understanding what that story is so important for organizations as well as for individuals. And we are so grateful for the help of groups like LHRI for digging into these stories.
Thank you both for sharing the stories of the Hickory and the Jefferson families. I'm curious, in your research, studying these allotment stories, have you faced any barriers? Russell, do you want to?
Sure. Yes, we have faced a number of barriers, and if you give me the clicker, I'll walk you through a few of those. I don't know if I can't remember if it's before this or after this. Here we go. Yeah, we're going to go back here. Yes, there are a number of barriers, and I'll just walk you through a few of them. One is when you read these documents, you can read them literally, as we're trained to do, but you also have to question what is being said and why it's being said. These are just, this is a sample of a letter. Actually, I got from the Oklahoma History Center. This was from a letter written by the spouse of Minnie Atkins, who was kind of held across the street from Charles Page, and her husband. I found this letter. He said he was not allowed to leave the house until Charles Page returned, and so. There's this thing, he says, I'm alone. He writes to his friend. Actually, his friend was the chief of the chief of a Yuchi town. And he wrote to the chief and said, I'm alone here at house, so I would love to, wondering when Mr. Page would come home, as I am getting tired of this kind of life. I'm not used to living like this. And, so when I read this, I wonder, what is really going on? Because the big picture is that we have a story that Oklahomans like to tell about. We have a series of oilmen who are philanthropists. So they're not just oilmen, right? But they're philanthropists. They're people like Wade Phillips, like Charles Page, like Thomas Gilcrease. And the story that's been told about them, the story they wanted to tell, was one of wealth, prosperity, and beneficence. And I think that underneath there's a lot of other stuff going on. And so one of the barriers is trying to question that history without in a clear and an open mind, right? So that's one of them. Another is some slippery accounting. And if you listen to Connie Conley's keynote, you'll know that there was. I like that she said that many of these people were as crooked as a dog's hind leg. And you can just see it just in some of their accounting. This is another document I found where you can see that the guardians, as we talked about, are often paying themselves at exorbitant rates, sometimes marking it down, sometimes not, sometimes brazenly leaving a trail of what they were doing. So some of the slippery accounting narratives. And then, of course, what I would say is the most deliberate erasure of Mvskoke stories of all, which is the oil capital mythology. And again, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that, that some of the stories that are told of these people are false. They are, as one writer has said, and her name is escaping me, she said stereotypes. It's not that they're false, it's that they're one story. And we have heard one story for a long time. And you can see how that story was crafted. It's crafted in the Golden Driller statue in Midtown Tulsa. It's crafted in the press. The Tulsa World and Tulsa Tribune, they wrote the first draft of Tulsa's history. This was their headline when Togobuji passed on. He'd lived through so many important events, was such a pivotal character in Mvskoke Creek history, and the Tulsa Tribune. Its takeaway from that was Togobuji, hater of whites. So I think that there's the deliberate erasure as well, and those are the three things that I think are the big obstacles and ones that we need to face and think through.
Tanya and Susan, do you have anything that you want to add?
Probably add a few things. Since you know how that works, we go to like that one document. It's not really.
Which one?
It's probably one at the end. Okay. So, to me, things like this, I found this interesting. Last year when I did my presentation, I talked about what appears to be suspicious documents. How do you take a grieving family the day of their daughter's death, take them to the courthouse, and use their thumbprint and an X? Now we come to 1931 where the kids are adults. And in this document, you can go to the next one if you don't mind. Sam Hickory talks about the fraudulent documents, how his parents were pulled into a competency hearing. And he discussed all these problems that were wrong with the sale of all these different lands in the Hickory family, Chugabajis, Tom Cooney. Why do I always forget these? And ones you don't even hear about, Ned Chugabaji, Moses Cooney. Anyway, then you go to the next one, if I knew how the clicker worked. So anyway, he presents this really great case. And one more. And then when you get, and this is how I see the abstract. So to me, this is a barrier. Then, as you see at the bottom, it says the files in the above case are missing. This is 1 month later. He makes this great case, and now it goes to silencing deeds. So this is really peculiar to me. And I find that a barrier because we've heard of, a warehouse being burned down with all the documents. So that makes it a big barrier to really get to the truth of things. the language barrier from my great-grandparents to even my grandmother. My grandmother went to Purcell, a Catholic Indian boarding school, so when she came back, she wasn't allowed to speak the language. She knew it. So those stories don't get passed on. And so that's a couple of the barriers that I noticed. And then coming back here, like I said, the first year we were in quarantine. That was a big barrier for everybody. But, you know, a lot more things are online. The other thing, if you go to our website, you'll see it, the Tulsa County Clerk, they put all their land records online. That's a wealth of information. But even those sometimes, and I'm not accusing anybody, it's a lot of documents. They're not in order. Sometimes you don't get what you're looking for. But there's some pretty interesting things there. But, yeah, I mean, those are just a couple of the barriers that I've experienced.
And those are our barriers that we found on our organizational side as well. And another barrier is really thinking about, as Russ mentioned, is reading between the lines. What is a governmental record and what story are they trying to tell? They're creating these documents for a very specific reason, and really understanding the multiplicity of the stories. And we are so interested to understand the indigenous story, the native perspective, the story of the family and the families of the allottees just in general. And that's one reason being able to speak with the Jefferson family descendants, including Barbara, has been such a benefit, a blessing for us, and also to show that respect, that it is not an institution trying to tell a story, but trying to tell a story of other people. And we don't want to be we want to lift up and share stories like the Lucinda Hickory Institute and be sort of this platform. Other barriers include that some of these documents, sort of as Tatiana mentioned, are in archives that haven't been digitized yet. And so something that we as institutions can do is make sure that our doors are open. We don't have a lot of those documents, but if we have anything, we would share them. And so one of the reasons we wanted to come today was to reach out to other organizations and try to make these connections so that we can share our resources and share our knowledge.
That's great. So this is our last question, but learning is definitely a process, and we have a responsibility to knowledge as we go through this process. So with that in mind, what sort of displays, acknowledgements, or actions may be taken once a more complete story is understood? Tanya, would you like to take this one?
So, for me, acknowledging the history is really important. I think it's important for us as descendants to know what happened. I would say most of Tulsa was Mvskoke Nation, and north of Admiral turns into Cherokee Nation. And those lands are not owned by natives anymore. As far as acknowledgements, what Philbrook has done today has really been meaningful, and I'm sure it's meaningful to the family to finally be acknowledged to things that happened. When we kind of combine the two, talking about language barriers, because I've been doing this research for a few years, and Russ, right off the bat when I opened up their research, I noticed names that it's like, as soon as you see those names, the red flags go up. You look at Tugubachi died in 1910, his grandson died in 1910, and these are all next to each other, the allotments. Ned Tugubachi, his son, died in 1900. Moses, 1900. All allotments next to each other. Across the street, Lena dies in 1907, and that's a lot of people. And so communicating these stories with each other so that we can kind of connect the dots and just understand our history. It helps us understand our restricted lands today. People still have issues. We have not a lot of acres left in Sand Springs. My mother's been on her restricted land 2, maybe 3 times in her life, and she's 82 years old. That's just not okay. They've never been able to benefit and thrive. A lot of people haven't from their lands. So as far as like monuments or anything, that's not my realm of why I do this. I want answers to our land issues and help people find healing and closure, because it's a tough way to live. It has been, I think, for us.
for me, I'm a lifelong Tulsan. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather came to Tulsa for oil, and so I'm very much from an oil and gas family, and thought I knew a lot about the history of the place that I was rooted in and took pride in. And a few years ago, probably about 5 years ago now, when I started to learn a little bit about the story of Tokoboji, I felt like blindsided in a lot of ways, like somebody said earlier in another presentation, with this kind of feeling like, why wasn't I taught this? You know, why did I not know this? And even though it's a very different kind of, I come from a very different kind of orientation, and as a white person and on a Mvskoke reservation, I think it's important for my community as well to learn the stories, to be open-minded, to make yourself a little bit vulnerable. You know, I know that there's been a lot of talk in this state when it comes to education about how people might feel when they learn a truth. I think mature adults should have the ability to understand complicated truths and find ways that can blaze a new path or create better relations for their neighbors, because that's one of the things I think is just unique and powerful about the Oklahoma story is, after all of this, we're still neighbors. How do we get along? So, you know, I'm just here so for my part, it's just to help tell the stories in any way I can and find and learn, essentially.
And in terms of Philbrook, sort of next steps, Gianna, Lisa, would you mind clicking ahead? Or who has the clicker? Okay, click ahead. The power. Yeah. So thinking about, we want to be transparent. We also know, so organizations move really slowly. This issue is something we should have dealt with 100 years ago, let alone 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And what can we do? But what can we do now? So we don't want to wait. So one of the things that we've done, as this is ongoing, active, living research, as we reach out, we read things, we talk to people, we talk to organizations, the nation, other groups. And so we've literally made sort of a lab, a test-based lab with Post-it notes and pieces of paper taped up on a wall. And this is sort of the antithesis of what a museum does. A museum puts up exhibits that stay there forever, right? So we did the exact opposite. So in one of our historic spaces, we moved our sort of telling the history of the institution, we moved that space down to a larger space so we could tell a bigger story. And the story does not only talk about Lena, Jefferson, and the land upon which Philbrook was built, it also tells the history of Philbrook, so it's a bigger story, but one wall is dedicated to the history of the land. And so there are pictures of our archival images, and then our guests, our visitors, can write on these colorful Post-it notes and ask questions. And then we go through and we answer those questions. And then those questions become conversations with other visitors. And so it's been a really interesting space. And then as we work towards knowing what our visitors want to know, what we want to know also what our visitors know so that we can add to our own knowledge. And it can be a conversation rather than a one-way street. And so we will develop a more permanent exhibition, but it will be down the road as sort of this knowledge develops. And Russ, can you go forward one? So here's a sort of examples. And again, these documents are black and white. They aren't these, smiling faces. There's not the photographs. So it's literally the land allotment and saying these numbers, section, township, range, this is Philbrook. Answering the questions. We've had these wonderful responses in Mvskoke or in other tribal languages that talking about our land acknowledgement or asking questions, and we try to be as transparent as possible and as honest, whether it's I don't know or telling what might be hard truths. And then one more. So other things that we are doing are not only our exhibitions that we do regularly, including Hearts of Our People, which the amazing Christina Burke was the curator for, which was an incredible exhibition of all Native women artists across time, these incredible works of art. But working with groups like Matriarch, Thread, Postcolonial, the Native, and I don't have their name right, but the Native Pollinators Alliance, the Tribal Pollinators Alliance, everything from the big to the small, national to local, and to be as Joy Harjo doing performances and really thinking about the land and how we can transform the land for the public and having this bigger story. So those are some of the things that we're doing. But again, this is just a step. I know it's almost sounds like a cop-out. It's a first step, but we want to acknowledge that there's so much more work that we do need to do.
So thank you all so much again for listening. We have a few minutes if anyone in the audience would like to ask any questions.
Yeah, I would like to suggest that you guys add in your research pre-1898. Pre-1898, the Creek Nation owned all the land, the government. Each citizen in the Creek Nation had a right to a 2-year lease to use the land that was approved by the principal chief at that time. And so what's missing is how the federal government dispossessed the tribe of its land into individual allotments, where people own land, many of them just a few years, most of them never even seen their allotments. You know, when we think about if the allotments have not occurred and oil had been discovered in natural gas, the Mvskoke Creek Nation would be the Saudi Arabia of the world. Let's just be honest with that. You know, but in the research, we oftentimes focus on the allottee and what happened to the allottee. But there's a bigger tragedy in this. It's a bigger government taking the power away from a smaller government that used to own millions of acres of land where oil and gas was later found to be useful. And so that's really missing from the story because when you showed that letter where someone didn't choose your allotment because they were living on their own home improvement, at that point they had a 2-year lease from the tribal government. And if that person had died, the kids of that person would not have inherited that land. Those kids would then have to go back to the tribal government for a new 2-year lease. That was the system of the Mvskoke Creek Nation dealing with land used by its people prior to 1898.
Eli, thank you for that contribution. And I can tell you, we're new and we're still looking for. We're still trying to put our institute together. We don't have office space yet, so we can all meet and start really doing some research. So right now they are personal stories to kind of get the dialogue started. And I'm glad you brought that up because when I saw that about Lena Jefferson, I thought the same thing. And you can also, I think there's an old treaty, and I'm not an expert on the treaties, but they talk about it when you read N.T. DeBoe's book, and it was the same thing. A man's like, well, I think we should be going by the old treaties. He didn't want to select an allotment. He was already living a life, and these allotments disrupted the life that they were living. Thank you. Widow.
The green jacket.
You have a living board where you have questions and answers. Are you doing intricate documentation in time, showing what those questions were, what the answers were, that reflect that living board so you can have that for future use? And 2, did you ever find out what happened to the missing legal documents?
Excellent questions. So we're keeping every single Post-it that is put up on our wall. We keep even the ones that say "I was here" or "heart" or "great visit." We keep every single one so that we can go back. It's just the time that it takes to create that kind of framework. But we have to keep that because those are the contributions from our visitors, and that's how we learn and how we can best help our visitors explore these stories. And it's been really interesting because there's, you know, we do have sort of maps of the homelands and Oklahoma, and from a third grader saying, I learned about removal, I'm a third grader and I just learned about removal, to someone saying, well, why did the Indians choose this land? And then I love it, the visitors who say, wait a minute, they didn't choose it. The United States government chose it for them. So it's so important to keep that record and to keep that framework. And so thank you for that question.
Oh.
How does the McGirt Supreme Court
We have a special guest. We have a special guest. You've.
I'm a board member that didn't have to prepare for
The board.
No one ever asks an attorney
Talk
to
to our
speak
legal.
at your
Talk to our
historical
legal team.
places. I think historians out-talk attorneys. McGirt is very positive. First of all, we'd like to think we're building community, don't we? We want to build community. And finding the resources to prosecute cases has been addressed. It is being addressed. Our light horsemen, everybody knows light horse is our police force, and our courts have tripled. Dynamic, wonderful, brilliant young lawyers are prosecuting cases. More to be done, more to be done. And what I think McGirt overall, saying the reservation boundaries have never been disestablished. Justice Gorsuch is an originalist, and he held the written word. This is what you said, this is what I see, and this is the situation. Congress said they will not be disestablished until Congress says they're disestablished. Did that happen? Will you find any discussion about that? You won't. So now we have the McGirt opinion, and we have wonderful work being done. I think the hysteria of the sky is falling has been so wonderfully, if you think of it in the positive side, addressed. And the far exaggerations, I think we need to examine and keep examining if in fact those are true. Everyone that I've seen, as we break it down as an attorney, what happened, somewhat are really different in actuality. My take is just coming back and not having any McGirt cases at all for my practice, which is now retired. But the fact is, I think the McGirt opinion was absolutely correct. People now understand that it was correct, and we are strengthening our systems. I think we're strengthening community, strengthening the richness and the wealth of history that the great Oklahoma swindle was. We can live with that. We can face truth, and we can continue to work to build a, Oklahoma's a good place, and we want to make that truth be out there. It gives us an opportunity to do. Well, I'd like to hear Dr. Cobb's comment, though. If you have one.
I mean, in terms of land, I don't think, maybe symbolically it affects it. I don't think legally, am I correct? Yeah, I don't think legally it affects land holdings. It's really important to, a member of our board who couldn't be here today, Gano Perez, once said, I was kind of venting to him, and I said, oh, Gano, well, you understand that when I talk to my community about this, a lot of them panic. And they say, oh my God, they're going to be taking our land back. And they see land back, and oh, I'll be kicked out of my home. And Gano said something really interesting to me. He said, we as a people know what it's like to be kicked out of your home. And we wouldn't wish that on anybody. And I think it's more of a long-term relationship building, rebuilding that does not need to succumb to a bunch of hysteria about everyone's going to take your land. So that's all I got to say about that.
We have time for one more question, yeah.
Hi, really appreciate the work you guys are all doing. Are you looking for like volunteer researchers or some kind of support? Cool.
Yes.
I'll talk to you later.
Oh, that was an easy one.
That's
Yes.
a great question.
All right, we'll all be around this afternoon, so please come find us, and thank you again for everyone for listening.
Thank you to the panelists for coming and starting this conversation, and we hope that it continues.